Hello! Today we're going to be talking about the Canon EOS R6 compared to the Fujifilm X-T4. Let's get into it. As always, we are only going to be talking about the video capabilities of each of these cameras. The reason I chose these two cameras is because they have very comparable specs and price points. Right now I'm filming on the Canon EOS R6 because it's my main camera, and my good friend Michaela did all the filming for the Fujifilm X-T4. In this video, we're gonna compare video specs of each camera, we're gonna look at some comparison footage and talk details, and of course, we're gonna talk about pricing. So let's first look at the video specs. The Canon EOS R6, it does up to 120 frames per second in 1080. It does up to 60 frames per second in 4K. It has in-body image stabilization, it is a full-frame camera, it has dual SD card slots, it is touchscreen, and it has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. Next is the Fujifilm X-T4. It does up to 240 frames per second in 1080. It also does up to 60 frames per second in 4K. It also has that in-body image stabilization. The X-T4 has a crop sensor, which is the APS-C crop sensor, and it's about a 1.5 crop. It also has the dual SD card slots, it's touchscreen, and has Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. If you were to strictly look at the video specs we just talked about of each of these cameras, you'd see that the Fuji and the Canon are extremely similar. When it comes to professional shoots, both of these cameras have everything you need. They both film up to 60 frames per second in 4K, they both have in-body image stabilization, and they both have dual slots for SD cards to back up what you're filming. The only difference between these two cameras is that the R6 is full frame and the X-T4 films up to 240 frames per second. Those two things, in my opinion, are preferences. You don't actually need them for professional shoots. Okay, now let's talk more details and look at some comparison footage. For our comparison footage, Michaela and I filmed my sister, the artist of these two paintings. Her info is in the details below. So let's look at the R6 first. So in these first few shots, the lens that I used was the Sigma 35mm. The ISO was on auto, the shutter speed was at 125, and the f-stop was at 1.4. The IBIS was also on, and I was filming in 4K at 24 frames per second. And the autofocus was also on. I also had an adapter on, which I will talk about later in this video. When you're watching this, just note the coloring, the movement of the camera, how the autofocus tracks eyes, and how loud the autofocus is. Okay, so these next few shots had all the same settings as the last one, but it was changed to 4K at 60 frames per second. And because I was now filming in 60 frames per second, I was able to slow the shots down to 50% speed in post. Okay, so these last few shots were filmed in 1080p at 120 frames per second. It was filmed using the Canon 50mm 1.8, the ISO was on auto, the shutter speed was at 125, the f-stop was at 1.8, and the IBIS was on. The autofocus was also on as I was filming this. Okay, I just wanted to give you guys a little bit more of an autofocus test on the R6. I'm on my 50mm 1.2, and I'm on autofocus, but I'm touching the screen to get it to focus on different areas, like getting to focus on that vase right there. There we go. But just listen to how loud it is. And I'm not on a mic right now, so this is also sort of a test of the mic, but anyways, the autofocus with the adapter still works great. It's just a little slower and a little louder. Now keep all that in mind because we are going to look at the Fujifilm X-T4, which Michaela's going to talk about.
Hello. The past couple months, we've both gotten our new cameras and had a chance to kind of mess around with them. So we're making this comparison video and I hope it's helpful. So for starters, right now we're shooting on the Fujifilm X-T4 at 24 frames per second and 4K. Something to note is that I do use the Fringer I think it's the FX to EF adapter Mark II. It's the Pro. When it comes to the Fringer for autofocus for video, I will say it's rather noisy. I shoot all my video in manual focus, so this was not a deal breaker for me, but it's definitely something to note, and autofocus for photos has been completely fine, and I've gotten some great shots. So now I'm doing a little autofocus test where you're going to be able to hear the jitter, but you know what? It works. And considering that this is an adapter, I've been pretty impressed with it. Currently on my Sigma 20mm f1.4, and the autofocus is doing pretty good, but I will say, you can hear it. You can also hear my chair. Vertical. Oh my gosh, I'm having fun. This is fun. This is good, guys. So I will say that for people who might be beginners, Fujifilm's menu is a little bit intense. I wouldn't say it's quite as user-friendly as either Lumix or Canon. For someone who's been doing photo and video stuff for over like 10 years, I had to do quite a bit of research to kind of figure out how to best take advantage of all the settings, but I will say it's a little bit overwhelming. I'm still really impressed with the video quality and the photo quality. Saoirse has had some problems with the camera overheating, I guess, at 4K over I think 30 minutes. To me, I have yet to have a overheating like message come up on the camera where it's actually warned me that the camera's overheating, but I will say that to the touch that the camera does get pretty warm when it's shooting in 4K, especially over an extended period of time.
Okay, I will say with Canon's overheating, it wasn't actually a message. You'll see here that the countdown at the top left of the camera was actually going down. So it starts at just under 30 minutes. And then as the camera got hotter, it went down to 25 and then 20 and then 15 and then it would go all the way down.
So the actual body of the camera is honestly really nice. It's got a more vintage look to it. It looks like a classic film camera. There is a 360-degree swivel screen that's touchscreen. All of the dials at the top, these dials at the top are really cool. They kind of give a vintage vibe in terms of film cameras and editing settings. The one thing that I would note is that they can get bumped. They can get bumped pretty easy, and the camera screen sometimes can compensate for what your settings are. And so I've had a couple times where I forgot to lock, which is this little middle button. You just gotta press it down. And my settings got switched just between putting my camera in and out of the camera bag. And so that's just something to be mindful of.
Okay, now the last thing that I wanted to talk about was pricing. My setup with the R6 and the EF to EOS R adapter was about $2,500 for the camera and $100 for the adapter. So we're looking at about $2,600 total.
This camera is marked at about $1,700 retail price for just the body only, and then if you're wanting to get a lens with it, it's about $2 grand, even a little bit more expensive depending on what lens you choose.
Overall, the Fujifilm is about $1,000 cheaper. So all in all, these two cameras are super similar and very comparable. Like Michaela mentioned, Canon is much more user-friendly, especially for beginners. The coloring between the R6 and the X-T4 are slightly different, and whichever one is better depends on just your preference. I personally like Canon's coloring better. Michaela personally likes Fuji's coloring better. The autofocus on both cameras, the IBIS, 4K, they're all similar enough on both cameras. These are both great, beautiful cameras, which is what I wanted to show you guys. When I first started getting into filming and buying gear, I was so fixated on trying to figure out what the best brand was or what the best gear was for what I wanted. With this video, I wanted to show you guys that cameras with comparable specs, like these two cameras, aren't that different. No matter the brand, they just aren't as different as you might have been led to believe. What everything comes down to is what your preference is and what you have taken the time to learn. I prefer Canon, my sister prefers Sony, Michaela prefers Fuji. If you take anything from this video, just know that both of these cameras are super similar and they're both really great for filming. I think the R6 would win in a fight. Michaela thinks the X-T4 would win in a fight, but that's because of her own biases and preferences. I also want to show you some example footage so you know what you might be getting with either camera, so I hope that was helpful. But all in all, lesson here is that you just need to pick what you like because there isn't one that's gonna always be better than the other. So yeah, that's all I got. Be looking out for my next few videos because they're all gonna be based in Walt Disney World, which, I mean, who doesn't love Walt Disney World? Anyways, thanks for watching, guys.